Hello. Before we begin, I just want to say a quick spoiler warning for the finale. If you haven't seen it, I'm honestly not sure why you're here. You should probably go watch it yourself, no? Also, importantly, trigger warnings for topics of abuse and suicide. If those things disturb you in any way, please continue the video with caution or do not continue the video. And with all that out of the way, let's get right into it. Alright, let me address the elephant in the room. I am not here to justify or defend what Jax did throughout the series. If you hate Jax because of her actions, I think that's completely fair. She hurt people around her, pushed literally everyone away, and made choices that had real drastic consequences. This is not a defense piece. What I want to talk about instead is why I believe Jax's story is so emotionally powerful and why it resonates with so many people, myself included. To do that, I want to look at three things: the context behind her actions, the meaning of her abstraction, and the fandom's reaction to her character. Before we talk about Jax's ending, we need to understand how she got there. With the release of episode 9, we finally learn more about Jax's relationship with Ribbit and the events that shaped her life before the circus. What we see is someone who grew up in an incredibly abusive environment. Her father was constantly disappointed in her and eventually abandoned the family during her freshman year of high school. After that, her mother, already struggling with grief and depression, began projecting those emotions onto Jax. She was constantly compared to her father, pressured to meet impossible standards, and made to feel guilty whenever she tried to stand up for herself. One of the most painful details is how her mother weaponized Jax's masculinity against her. Whenever Jax showed anger or independence, she was told that she was becoming just like her father. Over time, that kind of treatment can leave anyone deeply ashamed of who they are. Then comes the moment I believe defines Jax's character. Well, it's never stated outright. The subtext strongly suggests that Jax came out as trans to her mother. Instead of receiving support or understanding, she was met with anger. Even worse, the affection that followed felt less like acceptance and more like an attempt to fix her. To me, that's the moment where Jax's fear of vulnerability truly begins to show itself, especially given that it occurred relatively soon to her entrance in the circus. When opening up about your identity and it resulting in rejection, it can become incredibly difficult to trust people after that. That's why her conversations with Ribbit are so important. For the first time in the show, she begins opening up and letting someone see the person behind the wall she built around herself. She trusted Ribbit. She was...
Hey, what's in there?
Then Kaufmo interrupts. Jax panics, realizing she had just opened up to someone for possibly the first time in a long time. She spirals. The progress she made with Ribbit, all gone. Just like that, she began to fall back into her old tendencies. What I find most interesting about all of this is that the story never asks us to excuse her actions. In fact, I personally believe it does the opposite. Jax isn't presented as someone who deserves forgiveness because she suffered. Her pain explains her behavior, but it does not erase the damage she caused. The show, I feel, understands that. That's why I don't view her as a redemption story. I view her as a cautionary tale. A person who spent so long hating herself and pushing others away that she became unable to accept the love that was actually offered to her. And that tragedy isn't that nobody cared about Jax. It's that she eventually stopped believing she deserved to be cared about at all. And that idea becomes even more important when we look at her ending. Throughout the amazing digital circus, abstraction functions as a constant looming threat that hangs over the entirety of the cast. But I also think it serves a deeper thematic purpose. To me, abstraction represents self-destruction, possibly even suicide. Not necessarily in a literal one-to-one sense, but as a metaphor for what happens when someone becomes consumed by isolation. One criticism I've seen is that Jax's abstraction feels abrupt. And to be honest, I agreed with this criticism at first. I was in complete shock in the theater, and I felt like the abstraction wasn't quote unquote earned. However, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the suddenness may actually be the point. Self destructive behavior is rarely dramatic in the way stories often may portray it, especially since we're viewing it mostly from an outside perspective up until episode 9. People aren't always open about their emotions. This especially applies to Jax. They also don't always leave obvious signs for everyone around them to notice. Sometimes the people closest to them genuinely don't realize how bad things have become. That's why Jax abstracting off screen ended up being an artistic choice I began to really appreciate. While the rest of the cast is focused on processing their own struggles and finding meaning in their lives after the brain scan revelation, nobody realizes what's happening with Jax until it's already too late. Especially the scene where Jax seems like she's finally about to open up to Pomni. I've seen some people argue that Pomni's reaction feels strange or out of character. Personally, I see it a little differently. To me, Pomni looks visually surprised, almost like she's genuinely shocked, yet hopeful that Jax is willing to at least try and say anything at all to her. I see this as her giving Jax space to speak, and the tragedy is that Jax never takes that final step. Another criticism I've seen is that abstraction lets Jax avoid accountability. And honestly, I think that is a fair point to bring up, but I also think it assumes Jax's story was about redemption. To me, it wasn't. Like I mentioned before, I feel like it is about a cautionary tale. Jax's ending isn't about escaping consequences. It's about becoming trapped by the consequences of her own choices. She spent so much time refusing help, refusing to be vulnerable with anyone, and refusing to confront the pain that she never got to be the person she could have been. That's the real punishment. It's not the death, it's not suffering, it's the regret. The knowledge that happiness and connection were all within reach for her, but she couldn't bring herself to believe she deserved them. And that's why I think this story functions as a warning. It's telling us not to make the same mistakes she did, to be kinder, to accept help, to let ourselves grow, and most importantly, to not give up on ourselves. I want to clarify that this section is mostly based on my own experiences in online spaces like TikTok and Twitter, therefore it is anecdotal at best. Ever since Jax was revealed to be trans, I've seen a lot of discussions surrounding that decision. Most of it has been positive, given how much fan art, analysis, and support there is for this decision. But there's also been a vocal minority pushing back against it. From what I've seen, these reactions generally fall into 3 groups. The first group is the easiest to address. That's transphobes. There's really not much to say here. Some people just really dislike the idea of a trans character existing in media. Their criticism is very little to do with the writing or the characterization. It's just pure bigotry. I don't find these arguments worth engaging with because they're usually very disingenuous. The second group is what I would call blind Jax haters. Again, disliking Jax is perfectly reasonable. The show practically invites you to be frustrated with her. The problem comes when people use her identity as further ammunition against her. I've seen arguments claiming that Jax is bad representation because she's flawed, angry, or fits negative stereotypes. And to that, I have a question. What exactly do people think representation is supposed to look like? Because representation isn't about creating perfect people. It's about having characters with unique perspectives who are just as flawed and human as everyone else. In this case, that's obviously trans people. Trans people can be kind, selfish, they can be heroes or even villains. They're allowed to be messy, complicated, and deeply flawed. Jax's story wouldn't be valuable if she was a perfect representation of trans people, which in itself is not even possible because of how many unique experiences there are. The value here lies in the fact that she is a believable representation of one person's experience, specifically with how much the character appears to draw from Goosework's own experience and emotions. The final group is what I will call the blind. These are people who aren't opposed to Jax being trans, but argue that the reveal feels forced or unsupported by the narrative. And while I can understand where that criticism comes from, I honestly find it difficult to actually agree with it. Because once you know the reveal, a lot of Jax's actions take on a whole new meaning. Her fragile masculinity, her internalized misogyny, her constant need to perform toughness, and most importantly, her discomfort with femininity. All of these traits take on different meaning when viewed through the lens of someone struggling with identity and self acceptance. Her relationships with Gangle and Zubul become especially interesting. You can interpret Jax's hostility towards Zubul as jealousy towards someone who's able to openly express themselves and be accepted for who they are. Likewise, Gangle represents many of the qualities Jax suppresses within herself: vulnerability, emotional openness, and sincerity. Rather than simply disliking them, Jax may be reacting to qualities she sees in herself and desperately wants to reject. Other details that support her transness include the maid dress. She had such a visceral reaction to having it put on her that it seems a little overblown unless she was compensating for something that she doesn't want others to know. Then, of course, there is the bow from Ribbit, a symbol of their acceptance towards her, one of the last times Jax ever felt at peace with herself. Whether you agree with me or not, it doesn't ultimately matter, but personally, I think the groundwork was always there. At the end of the day, Jax's story resonates with me because it isn't really about redemption. It's about teaching self acceptance. It's about what happens when someone spends so long believing they're unworthy of love that they stop reaching for it altogether. The tragedy of Jax isn't that nobody cared. The tragedy is that she couldn't believe they did. As a trans woman myself, that message hits incredibly close to home. While I'm very different from Jax personality wise, I still connected deeply with the themes of shame and isolation about oneself. And that's why her story means so much to me. She's not perfect, she's not innocent, but she's human. And this story reminds us that healing starts when we allow ourselves to be seen and to accept ourselves for who we are and let others help carry the weight we were never meant to carry alone. I just want to thank y'all so much for sticking to the end and watching the whole thing. I know this isn't really a typical video for me, but I really wanted to talk about something so close to my heart. I really hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please drop a like and sub. It'll help me out, and it lets me know you want to see more of this, because personally, I had a lot of fun making it. Anyways, that's it for today. See ya.